Grace and peace to you all. It's Captain Roger from the Hanford Corps of the Salvation Army. Welcome to the Shield Online, our weekly worship and study time. Hey, I have this scar on my forehead. It's gotten easier to see as I've aged. It's from a night when I was about 9 or 10, and my family was camping next to a mountain lake surrounded by smooth, flat stones. I taught a boy from a nearby tent how to skip stones across the surface of the water. He got a little excited about what he was doing, and I got a little careless about what I was doing, and we ended up with me between him and the water just as he threw one particularly hard stone. My head saved the lake from being hit. It took 3 stitches and a gauze bandage that left me looking like the mummy to stop the bleeding. Good times. And because I have stories like this, and yes, I do have more than one, it is surprising that I love the narrative that we find in 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath. Big guys love the story of David and Goliath. I don't know what it is about us. Now, we usually hear this story told as one where the underdog defeats the champion, but that's not what happened. This tale existed to teach a specific idea, the idea that David could be king. Now, in Sunday school, Bible stories are cleaned up and simplified for children, often so much that they don't resemble the scriptural story almost at all. And those kids then grow up believing that they know the story when they don't, which leads to not understanding why these stories were passed on or what we should learn from them, which then skews the way we think about God and how we approach the world. For the next few weeks, we're going to examine some of the most popular Bible stories and how they are mistold and what we can learn from them once we know the true history. Let's start by telling the Sunday school version of the story of David and Goliath. This is the Sunday school version. This is what you'll find in a children's Bible. The Philistines and the Israelites didn't get along well. They fought a lot. But the Philistines had a giant named Goliath on their side. He challenged any Israelite to fight him, but they were scared. David told the king, "I'll take care of him for you." King Saul offered David his armor, but it was too heavy. David went to fight with his slingshot. Goliath laughed at this boy who came to fight him, but David threw his stone, and it hit Goliath in the forehead. Then David chopped off Goliath's head. Okay, that part's usually not in the children's Bible. The Philistines ran away, and David was a hero. The end. Well, there you go. There's the children's version of the story. And that's the one most adults know, too, which is disappointing. Grab your Bibles and turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to start at verse 1 and see how the real story measures up. 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. I'm reading today from the New International Version 2011 edition, which is the one we usually use for our weekly studies here. Now, the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. So I wish I could put a map up for you here. I know there's a way. I'm just not the guy who can do it. Now, the Philistines, they came from the west, and they pushed deep into Israel's territory by moving east through the valley of Elah. So they didn't need to struggle through the mountains that pretty much surrounded this valley. Now, Saul, he called an army together to meet them. And they each moved to high ground for tactical superiority, and the Philistines ended up on an eastern hill of the southern ridge, while the Israelites ended up west of them on the northern ridge. So you can see kind of they sort of, well, the Valley of Elah, it's almost like a highway into Jerusalem, and the Philistines seem to want to use it to divide Saul's territory in half because he controlled some up here and some down here, and the valley kind of ran through the middle. But as each side maneuvered to find an advantage, what happened is they drew into these long, awkwardly curved battle lines around this deep valley, and then they were stuck. Because to attack meant you had to come down off of your hill and then charge up the ridge your enemy was on top of, which is probable suicide. Neither side could move without giving the other one time to rain spears and rocks down on them. And as difficult as it is to understand without a real map, they kind of blocked each other off. So the Philistines couldn't go home without going past Saul's forces, and Saul couldn't go home without going past the Philistine forces. Once I stayed at this hotel, and there was this light outside the window that attracted a lot of bugs, and spiders had ringed that light with webs. And when I say webs, I mean webs. They covered everything outside that window. And as I watched the spiders catch the bugs, I would see that they would catch a bug and then they would rebuild their web, and they would build the edges of their webs out a little bit each time until their web stretched around the neighbor's web and cut it off so that, they would get the juicier bugs. But while Spider A was busy blocking off part of Spider B's web, Spider B was over on the other side doing the same thing to Spider A's web. And they almost ended up completely changing sides over time, which is kind of what happened with those two armies here. Go to verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. We'll talk about that in a sec. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. So here's what's going on. Seeing that neither army could move, the Philistines brought out this legendary warrior. And the translation that most of us use in modern days says that he was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit's about 18 inches. A span is somewhere between 6 and 9 inches, depending on who's doing it. The problem is that is a translation from around the 3rd or 4th century, and the older translations say he was 4 cubits and a span. So essentially, it's saying he's 6.5 feet tall, which was head and shoulders taller than the rest. The average height was somewhere between 5 and 5'6" for most people in that region at that time. So he would have been a big guy. Now, I am 6.5 feet tall, and when I stand next to most people, they think, wow, that guy's really big, because I am usually head and shoulders above them. So Goliath was an impressive sight. I'm not saying I'm an impressive sight. Goliath was an impressive sight. So not only did he stand head and shoulders taller than the rest, he was wearing this full suit of armor, and his spear had this metal point on it that weighed 15 pounds before they attached it to the small tree that he used as a spear. And we tend to hear this description and we get hung up on how tall he is. Like I said, best translated 6'6". But that's not the thing that most amazed the Israelites. What would have got to them, and you can tell this from the description, what got to them was the armor. Now, metalworking was a new technology at this time. The Philistines knew how to do it, and they controlled the knowledge and the mine sites really jealously. They used metal weapons. They clothed their men in metal armor. They put boys with metal shields in front of their best warriors and all along their front lines, both as protection and so that this wall of iron would just intimidate everyone who saw it. I say iron. It was probably just bronze. But you get my picture here, right? These guys were the superpower of the age. And this giant warrior in his armor was frightening. Verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." And then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. All right, well, why? Why are they afraid and discouraged here? Well, it's because they didn't want to face this challenge. It seemed too big to face. It seemed too strong to face. Goliath seemed too confident to face. Also, he had been the premier warrior for like 20 years, and people were well aware of his skills, and they didn't really want to put theirs up against him, right? Human beings respond to every challenge in one of two ways. We either face them down or we run away. And the Israelite army responded to Goliath's challenge by being terrified. But this story isn't over yet. Verse 12. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, according to Numbers chapter 1, verse 3, and other ancient records in Jewish law, a man needed to be 20 years old in order to go to war. Now, 3 of David's 7 older brothers were able to serve. And if you do the math on that, assuming David's mom was pretty much pregnant all the time, then David was under 15. And verse 16 says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand." So Goliath is keeping his opponents totally and utterly intimidated. In the morning and in the evening, when the sun's rays would be gleaming off of his polished brass armor, making him seem even larger, he would stand on the hill and challenge the Israelites to send someone, anyone, out to face him. And for 6 weeks, these two armies were stuck. Nothing changed. Jesse is sending David to bring his brothers and their captain some food and to bring back news because nothing's happening. Skip down to verse 20. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of his shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out into its battle positions, shouting their war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supply, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. So David has arrived just as the two armies line themselves up on their respective hillsides, each hoping that today would be the day the other side would screw up and move. David was there when Goliath made his challenge. But, verse 24, whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." So even while they're running away from the challenge, they're telling each other they should take it because we all celebrate when someone can legally avoid paying taxes. And David, seeing all these guys, on the front line, and then suddenly they're like, you go, no, you go. But he didn't understand how these people of God are responding to this. Verse 26 says, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He didn't get it. How could his people, God's people, stand there and let this man trash talk them? Why didn't someone do something? But instead of telling him why they wouldn't fight, the men just told him more about the reward. And when you go through this passage, you see one of David's brothers gets really upset about David openly questioning why no one would stand up to Goliath. Probably because one of those people not standing up to Goliath was him. And he takes it personally, and he says some unkind things to his youngest brother. But David, he just kind of blows it off, and he keeps working his way around the camp, trying to goad anyone into going out to fight Goliath. And then, verse 31, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Uh-oh. The king has heard about this kid stirring up his troops, and he wants to see him now. David, though, he's completely unfazed. He jumps right in. Verse 32, David said to Saul, "Hey, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." There's a noted brain surgeon who was taking a stroll one day, and he saw a boy on a scooter just smash headfirst right into a tree. And he realized that boy was seriously injured. And the doctor's like, you, go call an ambulance. And as he proceeded to administer first aid, a boy, not much older than the one who was injured, nudged his way through the crowd that had kind of gathered around and said to the doctor, "I'd better take over now, sir. I'm a Boy Scout. I know first aid." King Saul was renowned as the greatest warrior in all of Israel, and I bet he looked at David about the same way that doctor would have looked at that Boy Scout. Verse 33, Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant's been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it. I rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, and I struck it, and I killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hands of this Philistine." Now, this kind of single combat challenge, it was actually pretty common in the ancient world. It could avoid bloodshed and slaughter if everyone lived up to the agreement set by the challenge. But though historians agree challenges like this were common, they say that it didn't always lead to the peace that it was supposed to. And I'll be honest, I don't think David or his spirit impressed Saul so much that the king thought that he could beat the giant. I think desperation had set in. Saul had a secret. God had removed his favor from the king. 2 chapters back, the prophet Samuel had let him know in no uncertain terms that God was done with him. So Saul was trying to escape that judgment. He was living in fear that one of his enemies was going to destroy him. That could mean the Philistines. And Saul knew he did not dare to face Goliath, who had been renowned as an unstoppable force for over 20 years. What Saul wanted, what he needed, was something to happen that would change the balance of power. He needed some kind of distraction to get the Philistines off their hill so that he and his men could charge down on them instead of the other way around. And perhaps I'm being unkind, but I suspect he was hoping this duel would be a distraction, and when Goliath cut the boy down, it would spark the Philistines into making a mistake, like excitedly charging across the valley because they think they've won. Or maybe he would be able to use the outrage at the death of this child to inspire his men to make their own charge to miraculously rout the enemy. Saul did what any commander trying to create a distraction would do. He tried to equip David to get the most from the sacrifice that Saul expects him to become. Verse 37 at the end, Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. I should point out at this point, if you carefully read the Old Testament, Saul is one of 3 people in all of Israel's army who have metal armor and metal weapons. Only 3. Saul, his son Jonathan, and his war leader. That's it. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. See, Saul was equipping David to die valiantly. David had other ideas. To Saul, Goliath was too big of a problem to face, but to David, there was an honorable choice here and a shameful one, and he was going to do what he thought would honor God. I have no doubt that David fully expected to win. Verse 40 says, David took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand, he approached the Philistine. 2 quick things. First, we don't know why David picked 5 stones. It could have been that was how many fit in his bag. Or maybe he just liked the number 5. Or maybe he figured if he had thrown 5 stones and Goliath was still coming, he was already done for. Second thing, just as a point of interest, if you comb through the scriptures, you'll find that Goliath had 4 brothers. I'm not saying anything there, just pointing that out. Verses 41 through 44 say, meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said. "I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." You know, it's funny. When I was a kid in Sunday school, they never told this part of the story. Not once. Now, David's a shepherd. He's not old enough to be considered a man. He's armed with a piece of wood and a couple of small rocks, facing the premier warrior of the age, who's clothed in shining armor, carrying a very big sword, and Goliath has just promised to turn him into pieces small enough to be eaten by mice. I would have been a little freaked out. I would have focused on the impossibility of this situation. David, though, was fixed on something else. Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword and a spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Yeah, does David seem even a little bit worried here? No. Why not? Because he's not focused on anything other than God's victory. He's not even calling this his victory. Battle is the Lord's. This is God's victory. Verse 48, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. An expert slinger, throwing an average stone at a range of 35 meters, that's just over 100 feet, would strike their target with a forward velocity of 34 meters per second. David effectively just shot Goliath in the head with a .45 caliber handgun. As the text says, the stone sank in. Was that just luck? Not likely. Malcolm Gladwell, in his brilliant book David and Goliath, describes how paintings from medieval times show slingers hitting birds in mid-flight. Irish slingers were said to be able to hit a coin from as far away as they could see it, and in the Old Testament book of Judges, slingers are described as being accurate to within a hair's breadth. The Romans even had special sets of tongs made just to remove stones that had been embedded in some poor soldier's body by a sling. Imagine standing in front of a Major League Baseball pitcher while he's aiming a baseball directly at your head. Goliath, in the time that it takes to say the name Goliath, had gone from being the terror of Israel to a lifeless hulk on the ground. In the museum in Scotland, the sword of William Wallace is on display, the great Scottish war leader. A visitor was once heard saying that he didn't know how a sword like that one ever could have won so many victories, and the nearby curator, he said, "Oh, sir, you can't see the arm that wielded it. See, it's who held the sword that mattered. It's not the weapon itself." Proverbs chapter 21, verses 30 and 31 tell us that there is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord. So the victory here, it's God's victory. But what exactly was the victory? Now, it wasn't David killing Goliath. I mean, David had the advantage, even if most people hadn't realized. I mean, regardless of the strength, size, or technologically advanced equipment wielded by the experienced war hero of the Philistines, David won by being quick enough and accurate enough to strike before any of that could be brought to bear. That could be called wisdom or insight. David made his horse ready, as it were. But military victories are not what honor God. God's victory came in David's declaration that he was trusting in the name of the Lord. Goliath looked to most Israelites like too big of a challenge to fight, but David thought, he looks too big to miss. And look how this encounter ended. Verses 50 and 51. David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the sheath, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. Two armies couldn't find a solution to their standoff for 6 weeks. One boy who trusted in the living God turned the tide in a heartbeat. Like Luke Skywalker trusted the Force when firing a laser pulse through that exhaust vent to destroy the Death Star, David trusted in God and struck his target in the one small, vulnerable place he needed to. As we face the challenges of the world, if we listen to God's leading and seek his solutions, we can experience God's victory in our lives no matter how big the problems seem to be. No challenge is too big for God. That's a little Sunday school of a moral for me. I think what we need to really remember here is we need to be mindful of our choices. If I had been more mindful on that lakeshore all those years ago, I never would have put myself in front of a rock-throwing child. I would have known better than to trust his judgment about when to throw. There is another lie told about this passage that I want to address. This story is not about how great it is to slay our enemies. It's not a divine stamp of approval on war or duels or anything like that. There is no encouragement from God for any of the combatants to fight in this story. There's no push from the Holy Spirit to nudge David's sling stone towards a specific target. No breath from God propelling it to miraculous speed. In fact, even though David honors God with his words, we do not see our Creator show up in this story at all. We do see David stand up for the honor of the Lord, which is good, but I question if he chose to do it for any reason more than his own ruffled pride, just like most fights. Here at the beginning of David's life story, we see that he knows he should put trust in God, but then he does exactly what he wants to do anyway. This becomes the pattern for his life. When he grows old, he decides he wants to build God a marvelous temple. And God's like, no. You have too much blood on your hands. See, David's been responsible for all this violence in God's sight, and human violence is never God's chosen method for us to deal with our problems. Now, I don't want to take away from the truth that David declared his faith in God or that his trust in God was the real victory here, because those are important. I don't want to take away from the truth that we can and do experience God's victories in our lives whenever we trust in him. In Psalm 146, we find these words of wisdom. This is verses 3-5. Do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. When their spirit departs, they return to the ground. On that very day, their plans come to nothing. Blessed are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God. When we trust in God's victory, even problems that seem to have no solution begin to be resolved. Putting your trust in the Lord is remarkably easy to do. You can claim the hope that God offers you at any time and in any place. It doesn't matter who you are or where the challenges of life have pushed you. What matters to God is that you come to him with a heart willing to trust him. I tap here when I say heart because we all know that's where our heart is. The word heart, the way that they used it in Bible times, it's your seat of your will, your intellect, your choices, your thinking. God wants you to come to him having decided that you are going to give him your allegiance, your trust. I know that many of us here have given our lives to serve the living God, and we do our best to claim his victory in everything that we say and do. Sometimes we're very successful, and sometimes we forget. But God works with and in each of us to make us more and more like the people that he created us to be. If you have never made the decision to serve and follow God, or if you've made that decision in the past, but you kind of left it behind, today is an opportunity. If you want to dedicate or rededicate your life to God's victory, to following the way of Jesus Christ, to making godly choices as best you can, just pray right now. Don't wait for a better offer or a better time. There is no better offer than God's victory. There's no better time to claim that victory than right now. Just say, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. If you want someone to pray with you, send me a note. I'll be happy to give you a call, shoot you an email, trade a prayer in messages, whatever. All right? What's important is that you go with God. Remember, none of us has anything to fear if we go with God. And wherever we are, God is already there. All you need to do is turn and follow him. Grace and peace to each and every one of you in the coming week. I'll see you next time.